Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to be with you this morning. It's always lovely to be back in Scotland, so thank you for asking me back, Richard. It's a joy to be here. It's really an honour and a privilege for me to be able to put what you're doing in Scotland into a slightly wider context and tell you a little bit about what's happening in other parts of Europe. As Richard said, I was director of SILT previously and actually was around when this policy came into place. So anyone who wants to throw a tomato, please do so now, because I'm partly to blame for bringing in the 1+2 policy. And then, of course, I ran off and left you. Right? So I left you to pick up the pieces and to implement what is actually a very challenging policy. But looking at it from afar, I still believe it was the right thing to do, despite the challenges, and I'm not unaware of the challenges that you are facing. So what I'd like to do today is, most of your event is focusing on implementation. It's not my place to talk about implementation in Scotland. I'm too far removed. I do know some of the things that are going on, but it would be completely inappropriate for me to talk about what you're doing on a daily basis trying to implement this policy. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background, and that's partly also for our guests from outside Scotland who might not know the context of this particular policy. Look at how where it came from, and actually what progress has been made in Europe. Tell you a little bit about the centre where I work, because I think there are some resources you might find helpful, and then really just round up by reminding us all why we bother, because there are times where we despair, but I think it's worth it, and I think it's worth reminding ourselves of why it's so important. Before I start, I'd like to say a huge thank you to two people, one of whom is in the room, Louise Glenn from Education Scotland, and Fiona Pate, whom I'm sure you all know, but Fiona is on holiday, how dare she? But both Fiona and Louise provided me with lots of slides and information to remind me about what was happening in Scotland, to give me some of the background. So big thank you to both of you. My slides will be made available to you. You'll see that some of them do not have the European Centre for Modern Languages template. Where it is an Education Scotland slide, I have left the template because it's not my place to take it. But there's also one or two slides that I've taken from my colleagues in the European Union who recently presented at our centre, and I've left their template as well, so you can see immediately where the source is from. So really that's what I'd like to do, is to go back in time, situate the policy, look to see what's happening in Europe, because the 1+2 original European policy has just changed. And I don't know how many of you in the room are aware of a big change that's around the corner coming from the EU, and tell you a little bit about that. So where do we begin? If we go back in time, it's 2009, and I've just started at SILT, and I had the equivalent of one full-time development officer. That was it. There was me, two part-time development officers, and Mandy Lehman-Clark, whom I'm sure many of you know and love, as I do, and Mandy was there as my main support. But that's how tiny SILT was. And it was so tiny, and government was actually saying, do we need it? Do we need this support? The picture was a bit grim. Curriculum for Excellence was just coming on stream. That was quite exciting. There were changes. But any of you as old as me will know that languages at that point in Scotland were really not in a great place. And part of that was because of this constant chopping and changing of policy. It was compulsory. in the primary, then it wasn't. It was compulsory until 4th year of secondary, then it wasn't. They kept chopping and changing. Then there was all the money for what was MLPS, Modern Languages in the primary school. Then that money dried up, etc., etc., etc. And for people working in schools, it must have been very, very hard going. And part of the fact that we were in a grim situation actually was slightly ironic, because it came from a push to make things better. If you remember the famous Mulgrew Report, The Citizens of a Multilingual World, when that report came out, I was actually working in Spain, and I remember seeing it in the press and thinking, wow, Scotland's really doing something exciting. And it was meant to be a big push for modern languages. But in the way that policy sometimes goes a bit askew, this thing about the entitlement, some schools took that as a reason not to drop languages, not to make it part of the core anymore. And there were all sorts of other problems, the reduction in funding, etc. But the time of Mulgrew, that was 2000. 2001 was then the European Year of Languages, so there was a big buzz in Europe around language learning. And in 2001, I wonder how many people in this room know that there was another big report published in Scotland called Language and Literacy Policy in Scotland, because it was kind of buried. But this was Joe Lobianco, absolutely brilliant Australian researcher, who did a report on Scotland. And what he tried to do was to look at modern languages, look at English as mother tongue, look at all the community languages and bring them all together into a coherent policy, building on the Mulgrew Report. But somehow that didn't seem to have much of an impact, that particular one. So there were all these things going on, and then Curriculum for Excellence, there was then the Modern Languages Excellence Report. There were all the excellence reports in the different subjects, and there was a will to change things. There was a will really to make things a bit better. And I was involved in all those discussions with Scottish Government. What can we do? How can we make languages better? And then I woke up one morning and this was in the press. Don't quote me, but that's not quite what we were hoping at the time. That was way, way far in advance of what we expected, because that's a huge, huge change for Scotland. So at this point, primary schools in particular were struggling with one modern language, and suddenly two were there, right? So there was a wee bit of a panic attack, and this came out, well, it's ambitious. That's all I can say. It's very, very ambitious. But you know, it was a good idea to aim high, because I think if they had just said, let's just push for a little bit more of this and a little bit more of that, there might not have been the funding behind it. There might not have been all of the other things that have come into play. But that's not quite what those of us involved at the time were expecting. It took us very much by surprise as well. So that's what happened. But slightly ironically, it's 2011, this is the manifesto commitment. All parties were behind it as well, so there was support across the different parties. But in 2011, Scottish Government, or the United Kingdom as a whole, withdrew from the European Centre for Modern Languages. So there was a bit of a clash there. And, you know, that's why... there's my wee clip. It's a checkered approach, let's say, but that fits, doesn't it? Yes, that fits with Scotland and with our image. So that's what happened, and I'm going to look in a moment at where that European model comes from and exactly what was meant by that. What I think the government did recognise was that we had to make it work for Scotland. It was taking a European initiative, but our situation was in fact very, very different. So then there was the 1+2 report. How could we put this into place? All of the recommendations, I can't remember, I think there were 33. Government accepted most of the recommendations. And these are the key ones. Now, before I turn to them, this is for our international guests, because like every system, we have our acronyms and our names, and of course we forget that people from outside don't know what they mean. BGE, Broad General Education. So from year 1 of primary school, which we call P1, normally age 4 to 5, to the end of year 3 of secondary, S3. And then we talk about the senior phase. So I thought I'd just give you that little key so that you know when we use these abbreviations. So I don't need to tell people in this room what the key recommendations were, but just as a reminder, yeah? So suddenly, all of a sudden, there was the first modern language from primary 1. Right? Now that suddenly means every primary teacher's involved. That's an enormous change from P6, P7, which was a bit patchwork anyway. Some schools didn't have it really at all. Someone's calling. And then the idea of a second language. How are we going to do that? What teachers did we have? Who was trained to do it? So all these questions, who would do it? Which language? What resources? And there was just a general OMG, right? And then how do we encourage young people to continue to actually get a qualification? Now that is something that other European countries really don't quite understand, because where they have compulsory languages, it usually includes taking it to a qualification. So, and that to me, there's a bit of a problem there, of it has to go to the end of the broad general education and encourage, but it's not compulsory. You don't necessarily have a qualification at the end. So there's the key recommendations. I don't need to remind you of them. And right away, those of you who are not from Scotland in the room, if you imagine what it was like, there was only one language in primary, and that was often a bit insecure the last 2 years. Suddenly there were to be 2, and secondary schools could no longer say, we're going to start all over again because what's been going on in primary, we can't count on it. Right? Now that's, exactly, that challenge, let me tell you, is a challenge in every single European country. So you're not alone in that transition one. And in that, let's say, we have meetings in Graz where people from different sectors come together. And until you come together, there's all those myths about how the people in that other sector work and what their knowledge is. And it's not until you come together and challenge those ideas that people start to think differently. But what government did do was immediately start these pilots. And Richard was involved, I was involved in the pilots. And they did put money behind it, and they did say 2 parliaments. They didn't say by tomorrow. I work with many different ministries of education, and let me tell you that sort of gradual implementation is actually very, very positive. In some countries, a change comes like that, and people are given 6 months suddenly to change their curricula, their assessments, their policy. For example, even down south, things have been brought in much more quickly and without giving people the chance to absorb and make the changes. And there's the pilot schools. Now, who's old enough in the room to recognise these gentlemen? I say gentlemen because I think, there's one woman. There's the token European woman. Yeah, do you remember? This is a slide, as you can see, from the template, courtesy of my colleagues in the EU. Reminding us where the 1+2 originally came from. Now, it's actually quite interesting because directives to do with education rarely happen at these head of state meetings. It tends to be ministers of education who come together and make decisions. This was one where it went right up to the top, and all these important people said we have to improve the mastery of basic skills. Languages were considered and are considered basic skills, not an add-on, basic skills, from a very, very early age. They all said it, the countries all signed. Did they do anything? Not a great deal. Let me tell you, they didn't do a great deal. So 2011, Scotland says, finally, we're signing up, although they'd actually signed on the dotted line years ago. So they were 9 years behind, but the reality was you weren't behind because not an awful lot was happening across Europe either. Until this happened. Anyone know what this is? The European Survey of Language Competence. Yeah, 2012. This happened where suddenly Europe says, well, we need to measure. We need to see what's happening. And of course, the results were absolutely appalling. Appalling. So this is looking at your first foreign language. Who's up there at the top? Sweden. But with English. Okay? Who's down at the bottom? Sorry, Stephen. But you know what? England was really brave to take part in the survey. Scotland didn't take part. I will leave that one hanging in the air. Didn't take part for all sorts of reasons. But England then was named and shamed, and it was all over the press. And I'm afraid, French colleagues, France wasn't looking too good either. Right? So that was the reality, and that was the reality 10 years after the 1+2. Well, that's even worse. Yeah. And then when it came to the second foreign language, everyone can see that, look at Sweden. Sweden that was at the top, right? Because what was happening, and is still happening in many parts of Europe, so English is dominating, and young people think, I don't need anything else. So we have the problem in Scotland that kids think English is enough, but they have the problem too. It's really hard in many, many countries in Europe to motivate young people to pick up a language other than English. And you can see that from these results. That's what pushed for change. There's nothing like naming and shaming. Gets people moving. It's maybe not the way to do it. I don't think it's the way to do it. But that's what happened. That really then started to engender change across Europe. So if we look now at the two key recommendations that Scotland introduced, so starting earlier with your first foreign modern language and introducing a second one, how does the rest of Europe look? You all know the Eurydice report's key data on language and teaching across Europe. The latest report is 2007, published 17, but the data is from 2016. I think they do it every 4 years or something, I'm not sure. So, early start, right? You can see there's been quite a substantial change, and more countries starting earlier. So, Scotland, bang on track. You're doing exactly what other countries are doing. And then the second foreign language, less significant reforms, right? So when you're thinking about L3 and the very specific challenges and that, you know, embedding L2 is the first priority and then thinking about L3, actually the rest of Europe's thinking much the same. Now, this data relies on ministries of education supplying the data to Eurydice. Okay, so it doesn't always get the right data. And in the case of the UK, of course, it's trying to amalgamate data from across the devolved authorities, which makes it a little bit problematic. So if you look at that, I hope that's comforting. Scotland was definitely going in the right direction, and the change was fairly gradual across the rest of Europe now. Okay, so courtesy of Louise, thank you. I just wanted to say to you, well, do you know what? Scotland's not doing too badly at all, because this was from the local authority survey. So who's providing the second language and which languages from P1 onwards? 91%. I think that's a fantastic achievement. That doesn't say it's not problematic and there aren't concerns, but wow. That's absolutely superb in quite a short space of time. From S1 to S3. So that data's good. And then what I wanted to do was again, using Louise's slides, look at what the L3, what the language is. So there's lots of Spanish. The one that disappoints me is the Urdu. I think Scotland's not doing enough to support its community languages. And I think there's lots of languages in our schools that we could actually be drawing on more. And there are all sorts of issues around that, but I think possibly more could be done there. But Spanish, French, German, Gaelic, it's great. Oops. And then in secondary, the L3 is a similar picture in terms of the choice of languages. And then the combined Scots, that's great. That's absolutely fantastic that sort of that heritage is coming back, that people are recognising that and thinking about the connections with other languages, because anyone who's studied German and looks at Scots, there's so much there that you can draw on, one language supporting another. So I just thought I'd show you those slides to show you that if sometimes you despair and you think, oh my God, where are we going? What's it all about? Actually, Scotland is faring reasonably well. It really is. Of course, some countries are further. Some countries are also further behind you. Yeah? Okay. So, again, with thanks to Louise and Fiona, lots has been put in place to support. Now, I'm sure you're sitting there thinking much more could be done. Much more can always be done. But there's the policy, the funding, the pilots, the development offers. There's all of this. Support from Education Scotland, from SILT, support from PowerLanguages, Le Français en Écosse, strategies, with local authority strategies, and this framework for languages for initial teacher education, because that's one of the recommendations that didn't get accepted. When we did the 1+2 report, we recommended that modern languages was built into initial teacher education for primary teachers. But as you know, universities are autonomous, so government actually couldn't impose that. It's not as simple as that. But a lot of progress has been made. And I was looking at that framework the other day. I think it's got some really nice things in it that are not just for initial teacher education. It could certainly be used for continuing professional. No, that's not what you call it anymore, is it? I can't remember the term. What is it? CLPL. Do our foreign visitors know what CLPL is? Career-long professional learning. Right. Okay, other what? Professional development, career-long professional learning. So there's lots in there, lots of support being put in place. And I think evidence of impact. If you're not high on the political agenda, as I think I now know better from the position I'm in now, it doesn't work. You need to be up there, and it is. With all the problems that it brings, but it's still high on the political agenda. Do you think the benefits are better understood? Do you feel that with your children, with your parents? Yes? No? Yes? Yeah, I think so. I think gradually it's seeping into the kind of psyche that this matters. Fiona Pate, one of her the sentences that she wrote to me was, where it is working in primary, it's a joy to behold. And that's thanks to people in this room. And I think that's really lovely to have young children motivated to learn languages. And it's impacting on literacy, increased attainment. Now, numbers are down of children taking qualifications, because I get my SILT bulletin every week and check what's going on. But the ones who are taking it are doing better. And that's very, very, very positive. And it's all about those little people, isn't it? It's all about engaging them and making it fun for them. So you know better than I do about the support that's been put in place. You're in a better position to measure whether or not there is impact. But my sense, and talking to others, is that things are moving in Scotland. Does that mean the challenges have gone? Well, we'd all be out of a job if they'd gone. So think of it, think positive, think of it that way. So, I don't need to tell you what the challenges are. teacher language competences. And it's all about confidence, isn't it? You need to support teachers to feel confident to deliver. Now, I have embedded a link there, and I've embedded it to a couple of frameworks being used in other countries to support primary teachers develop their language skills. One is a model from Switzerland, and further down, oh, maybe it's not there yet. Oh no, the training one. The training one is a model that was developed a number of years ago. It was a number of countries involved where they were looking at supporting primary teachers doing a course abroad to improve their language skills and ways to evaluate that learning. You've probably got your own things in place, but sometimes it's nice just to see what other resources are out there. So these are all the challenges. I don't need to tell you about the challenges. That would just be completely wrong of me. Time is always a challenge. Fitting it in the timetable is one challenge, but perhaps a bigger one is that collegiate working. Time to get together with colleagues from secondary, time to speak to parents, time to promote. There's just never enough time. But that's kind of life, really. It's still not embedded in initial teacher education. Scotland needs to do something about that, because otherwise the funding won't go on forever, I assume. Otherwise, how do you make it sustainable? And that would be the real way to do it. But at least there are moves in that directions. And then, of course, there's all these pressures from other policy initiatives, which I know nothing about, but Louise and Fiona were telling me the Scottish Attainment Challenge, developing Scotland's young workforce. You must be dizzy, right, with all these, but actually they align. If you think about the benefits of language learning, the cognitive benefits, it's going to improve overall attainment, and it does. It pushes up literacy, and it makes people more employable. So it's not about seeing these as competing agendas. It's about latching on to them to push for languages. Use them as your vehicle to fight for languages in your school. If anyone's saying, just hang on a minute, this contributes to attainment, this contributes to employability, and the research backs that up. So yes, it might seem like pressure coming at you from all angles, but actually these agendas should be working in your favour and not against you. And I know that L3 is one of the biggest challenges. How do you do it? When we were talking about bringing in change, we tried to push for just starting with language awareness, just sort of awakening to languages. And I still think that's how it needs to begin. It needs to begin with that sensitization to language, to metalinguistics, to children picking up on different sounds, seeing how languages relate, and on the basis of that, you then can introduce another language. But that basis needs to be there first. So there's all the challenges, and I'm sure you could add to that list. Sure you could. Hello? Does it sometimes feel like that? Yes. However, should look like that. It's enormous, the challenge. I don't underestimate it, but it's worth it. It really is worth it, and it's really, really important for Scotland and for Scotland's future. So what I'd like to do now, so I've talked about the background to the policy, I've talked about where you are in relation to Europe. You know better than I do where you are, what the challenges are, what the support measures are. But since that policy was introduced, and since the EU introduced the 1+2, the world has changed. So I'm now zooming right out. I'm leaving languages way behind, and I'm going right out into a much bigger. Just take a minute to read those headlines. We've got far bigger challenges facing us in the world today. Okay, the rise of nationalism in its negative sense. Not about having an identity is one thing, but the nationalistic movements that are about not accepting difference and not accepting people from other countries and cultures. What about the second one? Do you see it as your responsibility in schools to be helping children think about terrorism and all the agenda around that? Should it be a safe space for them to talk about these things? There's a big debate about that, whether or not it should be allowed in schools. What about poverty? Sadly, it's on the rise. It's on the rise. And the more disadvantaged children there are, the less likely they are to get access to language learning, and they're the ones who really need it, okay? I'm not even going to mention the name in the 4th bullet point, because it makes me feel quite unwell. And I'm sure you would agree. Okay, look at this one from Spain. Real basic skills issues, basic literacy issues. And then Scotland, where have all the modern language assistants gone? Okay. And then England saying we need it for the workforce. Well, what are you going to do about it? Right? So there are bigger issues. The world has moved on. And the reason I'm putting it into that bigger perspective is because 1+2, the original European Union approach, has moved on as well. Is anyone in the room aware of the recommendation that they're trying to get through the European Parliament? No. Right. Okay, you recognise the gentleman? Do you know where he is in this picture? I mean, could be anywhere really, couldn't it? Right. He's at the Sorbonne. He's at the Sorbonne, and it's European Day of Languages last year. It's the 26th of September. Let me tell you, he didn't realise it was European Day of Languages, but that's by the by. He made a comment about languages, but didn't make the link. And what did he say? He stood up to these young people at the Sorbonne and said, everybody in Europe has to have 2 languages. All students need to spend time abroad. All teachers need to spend time abroad. We need to have European universities. And suddenly there was chaos because it wasn't on the political agenda. And then they called a summit. There was a summit in Sweden. And they all started to panic. What can we do to get languages back on the agenda? And they produced this recommendation for a proposal. Now, it's a recommendation because it has to go to the European Council or the Parliament, and then the Council, don't ask me, I can't remember. But anyway, it'll be spring next year before it goes through, if it goes through. But watch this space, because it's changed the original 1+2. And it's changed it quite substantially. So first of all, it's pushed the level right through the roof. Okay, so first foreign language, L2, proficient user level. Those of you who are familiar with the CEFR, and I know it's not the framework that you tend to use in Scotland, but you're talking advanced higher, right? In a Scottish context or beyond. Okay, and then L3, you're talking higher. Yeah. It's, ambitious. Will we just stick to that word, ambitious? It's ambitious, okay. But it's also changed, because what it's done is it's recognised that many children in European schools are already operating in a foreign language. So your little Syrian boy sitting in a classroom in Paris, French is already a foreign language for that child, okay, or a second language. And the European Union has now recognised that that counts. That will count as one of the 2 languages. So that's a huge change. And that's an opportunity perhaps for Scotland in terms of its community languages to really give them a bit of a boost. And it's also talking about language-aware schools. It's not, the onus isn't all on the teacher, you'll be glad to hear. You need the support from your head teacher. You need the support from your parents. You need that whole philosophy in the school that languages matter. Be they dialects, be they languages of migration, be they the languages on the curriculum, they all matter. And if you want to listen to me again, which I'm sure you won't after this morning, but I'm doing a webinar on the 26th of September through Education Gateway platform on language-aware schools. What is a language-aware school? What does that mean for all of us. Big push for language teacher mobility. How many of you have been able to take advantage of an Erasmus exchange? Some of you? Excellent.
I'm here at Erasmus exchange.
Woohoo! Am I running over? No? I'm okay? So there's a big push, more money for teacher mobility. So, but what happens if Scotland's not in the EU? Oop, sorry, I won't mention that. Anyway, and a push for inclusive pedagogy, so using all the languages in the classroom. Which, in fact, means that the European Union, in terms of its language policy, is actually just now aligning more closely with the Council of Europe. Now, I've put this little picture at the bottom. Everyone gets muddled about who's the Council of Europe, who's the European Council, who's the European Union. Yeah, they're not the same. So the Council of Europe, 47 member states, the first intergovernmental organisation set up after the war to maintain peace in Europe. Okay, and it's geographic Europe. So, for example, Armenia is one of my member states. Iceland is one of my member states. It's a slightly different organisation. We work very closely with our colleagues in the European Union, and their decision-making body is the European Council, and we're the Council of Europe. No wonder people get confused, right? We have the same flag. We share the flag, so there's further confusion, but just to kind of put it so that you don't get confused. But what I wanted to say is that these challenges, the social challenges that Europe is facing, the Council of Europe is working in these fields. It's developed this competence for democratic culture. What does it mean to be part of a democracy? How do you ensure that young people growing up value democracy? And the problem is they don't, because they've never known anything else. And how do we develop the right attitudes? And you can't see it because it's quite small, but the framework, languages, is in every part of it. Without strong language skills, you cannot really fully take part as a democratic citizen. And then, of course, there's a big campaign, no hate speech. Well, if there's one way to abuse language, it's through hate speech. We have a particular philosophy when it comes to languages, and I won't go into it in too much detail. But this diagram tries to sum it up. They're not silos. It's not the French teacher and the German teacher and the English teacher and the Gaelic teacher. It all comes together when you think about the learner. And it's not just about the languages on the curriculum, it's about the languages that that child or that young person brings with them. Their dialects, all their Scottish dialects. How can you draw on them to use it as a resource? Bringing them together, and how do they interrelate? And it's not just because it's an organisation about human rights that values the whole person. So it's not just the moral angle that matters, which of course is fundamental, but it's also because research shows us that we learn most effectively when we use all of the languages at our disposal. It shows us that the development of literacy in the language of schooling, so English normally in Scotland, or Gaelic if it's a Gaelic medium school, depends on their literacy in their home language. If that's not developed, they will not develop the competences in the other language. The research is clear on it. So it's not just the morally right thing to do, it's the right thing to do in terms of supporting learning. So I won't go into too much detail on that, but it's very learner-centred, but I'm going to challenge that notion in a moment, because sometimes I think too much learner-centred, we can forget that teachers are in there too and need a little bit of support. Very quickly, who we are. Some of you don't know the organisation, partly because the UK is no longer a member state. We're part of the Council of Europe, and the UK is still a member of the Council of Europe, but because this is a partial agreement, they have to pay extra money, and they chose not to do that. Okay, but 33 of the 47 countries have made that additional commitment to languages. This is what we do. I'll leave it all for you, but it's very much about supporting linguistic and cultural diversity. Aha. How good are you at flags? I'm rubbish. I had to go away and check them. I have to, but I thought I'd be really, really naughty and not give you the names. So what's the first one? Denmark. It's Denmark. It's Denmark, isn't it? So Denmark, I just wanted to kind of quickly sum up for you what other countries are doing, and that's because the work that I'm involved in brings all these countries together, so we get to hear about what they're doing and learn from each other. So English was always the first foreign language. They've brought it down 2 years, and then they've brought French and German down. They've just launched a new languages strategy. They've put a lot of money into it, as has, second flag, Ireland. New strategy. Now the Irish one is quite an interesting one. There's hardly a mention of primary. And I think, talking to colleagues, but they're focusing at the other end. They want more and more young people to get their hires or their leaving certificate with a language qualification. So they're pushing more at the secondary level. And that's their new strategy, and you should have a look at it, because they've also developed new curriculum specifications for some of the community languages that are in the country. Next one? Nope. Montenegro. Very, very poor part of the world. Very poor, but my God, are they working hard to make things better. Look at that. English is now compulsory from age 3. Okay? And the second modern language is in primary, and like Scotland, but it's the first, in this case it's their second, there has to be continuity into secondary. So a small country rolling it out, training teachers on a shoestring. Kindergarten, again, it's getting earlier and earlier. We'll be doing it in the womb soon. And this new framework where they're trying to bring together the languages of migration and foreign languages into one framework. And then the next one, which I've already forgotten what it is. Finland. Yeah. So again, bringing it earlier. And then the last one. Well done. Now this is an interesting one because of this whole thing in Scotland about ITE. I was trying to find who has it compulsory in ITE, and actually very few countries do. But some regions do, and they have it in specific areas. So there is an English module in initial teacher education in Austria for primary teachers, but then there are a number of optional modules, and in some of the border regions you can do a German-Slovenian module. You can do a module in sign language for primary teachers. That's fab. That's really, really fantastic. All of these descriptions are online. You can get them, you can look at them, you can compare them. So I just wanted to show you some examples that we pick up on through our work with other countries. At the ECML, the whole topic of early language learning was one, it was a bit fraught with difficulty. Nobody could agree how we should do it, so we had a think tank. We brought people together from across Europe, tell us your ideas. And what emerged was we need to support teachers more. Does that sound like the right thing to do? All this thing about treat it as a profession, treat us with dignity, treat us with respect. We're doing quite a difficult job. The whole thing about language awareness, social cohesion, the diversity in the classroom. How can we strengthen social cohesion? And what is the correct pedagogy? And we need teacher profiles. We need it embedded in the curriculum. We need modules to support us. And it led to a new project. Now Louise is just back from Graz, where the project team presented their new project. And right now they're building up their website based on the petals. There was a lot of debate about what do we mean by early language learning. Are we focusing on the languages the children bring? Are we focusing on introducing a foreign language? Are we focusing on both? What is it all about? Have a look on the website and you'll find some resources. But there's also on these links 2 very interesting presentations from a colloquium we held last Christmas. What's happening in trilingual Luxembourg. Now you might be sitting there thinking it's fine for them, they're trilingual, but they're not. because Luxembourgish is the language of schooling, and many, many children are starting school in Luxembourg without a word of it. So what do? How do they support them to learn it? And Ireland, very similar to Scotland, how do you deal with the languages of migration, and how do you introduce French or another foreign language in the primary school? So I won't go into them now because there isn't time. But it was really interesting at that think tank, some of the things people said, talking about the challenges they were facing as teachers, and they are the same challenges that you are facing in Scotland. On this slide, I just wanted to show you some resources that we have that might be of relevance, might help you. It doesn't matter that the UK, that Scotland isn't a member state, everything's free to download, so that getting access to resources is not. Parents, how do you convince parents of the benefits of language learning? And of course, in mainland Europe, the challenge is a bit different. How do you convince parents that English isn't the only language their children need to learn? They have a different challenge, but they have a challenge. And it's a nice leaflet just summarising the benefits. If you wanted to use that leaflet but change the text, you could send us a revised version and we would put it together for you, and then you could just have it as a PDF to print. Okay, but it summarises the arguments from research in a parent-friendly manner. The next one is about combining a kind of form of CLIL, so teaching history or a little bit of geography or whatever through the language, and raising cultural awareness. The third one is a lovely online module for teachers to think about their own attitude to languages and how is that impacting on the way you behave towards your learners, because it's there even though we might not realise it. And Plur Core is about languages across the school. Simple little projects to raise awareness of languages across the school. There's 8 case studies from different countries that you can pick and mix, look at them and see what you think might be useful. Am I still okay for time?
15 minutes,
I'll come to an end now. I wanted just to show you how we organise our resources. We organise them by themes. And these are the themes, and you may be sitting there thinking, but hang on a minute, because there's evaluation in early language learning, or yes, it's just a way to cut the cake and organise the resources. So you go in by theme and you can find them. What really matters is what sits in the middle, that it's actually about supporting and developing teachers to do their job. So I'm just going to flick through other more generic resources that might be of interest. I noticed looking at the programme, all the use of digital tools, how can this support learning? And this is a new project, and it's more, I would say, secondary, upper secondary, really challenging tasks for pupils. Real world tasks, updating a Wikipedia page. For example, doing things where the public will be commenting on your French. And my God, do children then pay attention to what they're doing when they know it's going open? But there's also a training platform for teachers in the use of digital technology, and it's linked to this database of tools. Yeah? You may have seen it, you may have used it, and you can see the filters. It's about the pedagogy, it's not about the tool, okay? But they're only tools that are free. They're tools that are simple to install, the instructions are all there, and they're linked to videos of people using them, and it's constantly being added to as a database of tools. I'm going to go very quickly. This is the last generic one. You're ever looking for partners, you want to set up a project, you're looking for a keynote speaker for a conference. This is a database of language organisations across Europe. You can filter it by country, by language, and it might help you find partners for some of your work. And I wanted to end with 2 resources that go back to the teacher, because that's really what it's all about. There's a lot of literature coming out right at the moment about motivating teachers, and that if it's all about the child, you can have the best resources, you can have the best curriculum. If that teacher's demotivated and doesn't feel valued, you can forget it, right? So what do we do to support the teacher? Because they are really the key. And this is a tool for student teachers, but I think you can use it for doing some continuous, whatever it's called, career-long professional learning in schools. Pick a bit, work on it. It's got descriptors you can use to try and assess where you are or where your team is at. And this is one designed for very young children, people working with very young children. And it's starting by thinking about what is your attitude to language and culture? Because most people working in this sector have no training in languages. So how do we build their confidence, and how do we set the pattern correctly with young children so that that keenness and that motivation and that love of languages begins at a very early age? They're all free to download on the website. All of my slides are hyperlinked. They'll take you straight to the publication. You don't need to remember, and Richard will distribute the slides.
Yeah, so PDF all the
Yeah.
presentations, and then we'll share with everybody all the presentations.
Another one I quickly wanted to mention, is there a particular issue in your classroom that's bugging you that you just can't get right and you don't know why? Have you ever thought about undertaking just a little bit of research into that area? Nothing big, long term, nothing complicated. Here's a nice online guide to looking at what you're doing, reflecting on it, and trying something new, and then thinking about how that works. So, it's all about the pedagogy. It's all about the teacher motivation, the teacher feeling supported, feeling confident, feeling valued. There's also all the promotion. You have to do that job too, don't you? Convince the children, convince the parents, convince your colleagues sometimes, convince your head teacher. And of course, I say language teacher, teacher of languages. It's just really, and you can't do it on your own. You need the support at all of those levels. My computer's just decided to die. That's fine. It's telling me my time's up. Okay, so that whole thing about promotion and support, I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room about the benefits. But do your learners know about them? Do your parents know about them? Does your head teacher know about them? Is he or she convinced? The benefits they're more and more now. The one I'm latching on to is it's stalling dementia. I'm hanging on to that thought big time, right? The rest I don't care about, but that one really, really matters. And all these myths, they're still out there. They're really still out there, and we need to keep fighting them. And one of them is that one child, one language myth, which I fell for bringing up my children in Spain. I thought I have to only speak to them in English and never in Spanish. It's absolute nonsense. They now know that it's nonsense, but you know, you believe it because it's out there. So we have to fight these myths. What's round the corner? European Day of Languages. I know you've all got your activities organised, haven't you? If you haven't, there's a website full of games, ideas, things you can do. And I thought we should end on an upbeat note, and I wanted to show you a little video that we produced last year. There was a competition, and young people had to say, I love this language because. And honest to God, I think we got about 5,000 videos. We were demented. But anyway, we put together a little collation of them. This year there's another competition, the most multilingual classroom. So all the languages, the dialects, and you can put your children in for that competition. Elise, let's see if the video runs. If you're looking for ideas, there's plenty on that website. You need to scroll down. Keep going. Editor's choice.
This one?
This one?
It doesn't go full screen, does it?
No, doesn't need to.
I like Hungarian because I can communicate in other ways and it makes me unique. I like Italian because pizza started there. English time, everybody feels alright. So you just have to smile if you want to speak. It's the light. Have you ever realized that anyone just loves English? So just come and sing it.
Amo l'italiano per piacere.
Per il miglior caffè del mondo.
per la natura così bella,
perché suona come la musica di un film romantico,
come la passione.
come la moda.
Amiamo l'italiano!
Je suis roumain. Et j'aime le français parce que cela sont amusant lorsque vous essayez de parler plus rapidement. Voilà. Si mon tonton, ton tonton sera attendu. Tonton, ton teta te lo teta tu?
Eu adoro a língua gestual portuguesa, porque a riqueza do seu vocabulário me permite expressar sentimentos.
You can watch it in your own time. It's really fun, and I think what it shows you is that children, if they're motivated, really love languages. They're really creative, and I think it's our duty to make sure that continues to happen. So I would just like to end by saying a huge thank you to all of you for the hard work you're doing to support languages in Scotland. I hope it's been helpful to see the bigger world, and that we can stay in touch and continue to work together, because I think we all have a real commitment to languages. They've changed my life, and I'm sure for many of you they've changed yours too. So let's make sure Scotland's youngsters get that chance too. Thank you very much.